You think scrubbing my floors makes you family? In my world, loyalty is bought with blood, not mop water. The surveillance monitor flickered with grainy footage of Kelly Brown stepping out of a coffee shop on Chicago's South Side. Across from her sat FBI agent Sarah Chen. Their conversation animated, familiar. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Lorenzo Antonio watched the screen with the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on knowing when someone was about to betray him. 3 enforcers stood rigid against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The Chicago River glittering 30 stories below like a snake of black ice. Vincent Russo, Lorenzo's second-in-command, leaned against the mahogany desk, his finger tapping the frozen image on the screen. 5th meeting in 2 weeks, boss, Russo said, his voice carrying practiced concern. Always the same location. Always before her shift at the hotel. He paused for effect. The maid's talking. Lorenzo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. At 34, he controlled everything from the South Side to the Gold Coast. Protection rackets that bled businesses dry, illegal gambling dens hidden in plain sight, loan sharking operations that turned desperate people into indentured servants, smuggling networks that moved millions through O'Hare every month. His reputation was forged in blood and maintained through fear. No one crossed Lorenzo Antonio. No one betrayed Lorenzo Antonio. And anyone foolish enough to try ended up in the Chicago River wearing concrete shoes. She's a leak, Russo pressed, sensing weakness. Her grandmother lives in that Englewood apartment building. Probably desperate for money. Got herself flipped by the feds. We need to clean this up before Chen brings the whole operation down on us. Lorenzo said nothing. His fingers formed a steeple as he studied Kelly's frozen face on the screen. Young. Black. Barely 26 years old. She'd worked at the Antonio Hotel for 8 months, scrubbing floors that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. Always punctual. Always quiet. Always invisible. Exactly the kind of person who made perfect prey for federal agents. I'll handle this personally, Lorenzo finally said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. Russo's eyebrows lifted slightly. Boss, we've got people for this kind of. I said I'll handle it. Lorenzo stood, straightening the cuffs of his Italian suit. She works in my hotel. She scrubs my floors. If there's a message to send, I'll deliver it myself. Have you ever witnessed a killer walk straight into his own destruction? The black Mercedes glided through Englewood like a shark through shallow water. Lorenzo sat in the back seat, watching the run-down apartment building slide past his tinted window. Graffiti. Broken streetlights. Boarded-up storefronts that had died slow deaths under the weight of his own loan sharks. This neighborhood represented everything Lorenzo had escaped from. Poverty, powerlessness, the suffocating certainty that you didn't matter. 20 years ago, he'd been that desperate. 20 years ago, in the slums of Seoul, he'd been the abandoned child of a diplomat who pretended he didn't exist and a mother who died believing her son would somehow survive. He'd survived by becoming something worse than the monsters who'd tried to destroy him. Now he was returning to a place like the one he'd escaped, to eliminate a problem, to clean up a loose end, to do what he'd always done, remove anything that threatened his empire. The Mercedes pulled up outside a building that looked like it was held together by prayers and peeling paint. Lorenzo stepped out, flanked by his 3 enforcers. The cold Chicago wind cut through the street, carrying the smell of fried food and garbage. 4th floor. Apartment 4C. They climbed stairs that creaked like dying things. Past doors covered in eviction notices. Heard televisions blaring behind thin walls and babies crying and an old man coughing like his lungs were trying to escape. This was the world Lorenzo had left behind. The world he'd sworn would never touch him again. He knocked on 4C. 3 sharp raps. The door opened. Kelly Brown stood there, still in her hotel-made uniform, her eyes widening as she recognized the man who paid her poverty wages. Behind her, the apartment was small but immaculate. Worn furniture, family photographs, the smell of something cooking on a stove. And there, by the window, sat a woman in a wheelchair. Lady D. She didn't flinch at the sight of 4 dangerous men filling her granddaughter's doorway. Didn't reach for a phone or scream or beg. She simply sat there with a worn photo album resting in her lap, looking at Lorenzo Antonio with eyes that seemed to see straight through his $1,000 suit to something he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. When she spoke, her voice was steady, knowing, and impossible. "You have your mother's eyes, Lorenzo. Kim Sun-hee." That was her name, wasn't it? The words hit him like a physical blow. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun under his jacket. His enforcers tensed, waiting for the order to eliminate these women. Kelly stepped protectively in front of her grandmother's wheelchair, her face a mask of terrified determination. But Lorenzo Antonio, the man who controlled Chicago's underworld, who'd killed his first man at 19, who'd built an empire on the certainty that weakness was death. Lorenzo Antonio couldn't move. No one in America knew that name. He'd erased every trace of his past, changed his identity completely, become someone new. Kim Sun-hee had died in poverty and soul, and her son had died with her. Or so he'd believed. Lady D raised one weathered hand, and despite the 3 armed killers crowding her tiny apartment, despite the notorious crime lord standing frozen in her doorway, she smiled with something that looked almost like recognition. "Put those toys away, boys," she said, gesturing at the weapons 3 of them were now half-drawing. "I knew this child before he became a monster." Lorenzo's second enforcer, a man named David who'd once beaten a rival to death with his bare hands, actually hesitated. Looked to his boss for confirmation. But Lorenzo couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. This elderly black woman in a wheelchair, sitting in a rundown Englewood apartment, knew his mother's Korean name. It was impossible. It was impossible, and yet she was opening that photo album with trembling but steady hands, turning pages with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Your grandmother and I made a promise," Lady D said quietly, her eyes never leaving Lorenzo's face, "that our families would be connected forever, that we'd look after each other's children." She turned the album toward him. The first photograph made his blood run cold. A young black woman, Lady D, 60 years younger, holding a Korean baby. The image was faded, edges worn from decades of handling. But the faces were unmistakable. I kept that promise with your mama, Lorenzo, Lady D continued. Now I'm keeping it with you. Lorenzo's hand moved instinctively toward the gun holstered beneath his jacket. Muscle memory. Survival instinct. The same motion that had saved his life a dozen times before. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the Glock, and his enforcers tensed like coiled springs, hands sliding toward their own weapons, waiting for the order that would paint this modest apartment red. But something in Lady D's voice, that calm, knowing certainty, froze him mid-reach. How did this woman know that name? Kim Sun-hee. His mother. Dead 20 years in a Seoul slum, her body cremated in a pauper's funeral, her memory erased from every official record. Lorenzo had made sure of it. He'd burned every bridge to his past, destroyed every document, become someone else entirely. And yet this elderly black woman sitting in a wheelchair in Englewood, Chicago, spoke his mother's name like she was calling an old friend. I said, "Put those toys away." Lady D's voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone who'd faced down worse than armed criminals. She gestured at the three enforcers, her weathered hand steady. "You boys don't scare me. I've stared down death more times than you've pulled triggers." David, Lorenzo's most ruthless killer, actually lowered his weapon slightly. Something about her commanded respect, even from men who respected nothing. "I knew this child before he became a monster," Lady D continued, her eyes never leaving Lorenzo's face. "Before the violence, before the empire, before he forgot what love looked like." Lorenzo's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about me, don't I?" Lady D smiled sadly. "Sit down, Lorenzo Antonio. Or should I call you Kim Lorenzo? That's the name your mama gave you. Lorenzo for the American dream she wanted for you. Kim for the family that abandoned you both." The room spun. No one knew that name. Kelly moved to her grandmother's side, protective but silent. Lorenzo's enforcers exchanged confused glances. They'd never seen their boss like this. Shaken, vulnerable, human. Lady D began her story with the practiced cadence of someone who'd told it many times in her own mind, waiting for this moment. Korea, 1952. I was 23 years old, a nurse with the U.S. Army Medical Corps, stationed at a field hospital in Seoul. The war was hell. Bodies stacked like cordwood, boys dying who were barely old enough to shave. Her eyes grew distant, seeing ghosts. When the armistice was signed, most of us went home. But I stayed. Lorenzo found himself listening despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, to eliminate these witnesses, to run from whatever truth was crawling out of that photo album. I joined an American missionary organization working in Seoul's poorest districts, Lady D continued. Places where the war had left nothing but rubble and starving families. We set up a church, a medical clinic, a food distribution center. That's where I met your grandmother, Kim Hae-won. Pregnant, alone, abandoned by the American GI who'd promised to marry her. The photo album trembled slightly in Lady D's hands as she opened it wider. Her fingers, bent with arthritis, turned pages with reverent care. The first photograph stopped Lorenzo's breath. A young black woman, Lady D, impossibly young, holding a Korean baby wrapped in a blanket. The baby's eyes were dark and alert, staring at the camera with the startled expression of the very young. Behind them, Seoul's bombed-out buildings rose like broken teeth. "That's your grandmother," Lady D said softly. "And that baby is your mother. I helped deliver her in our clinic. Helped Kim Hae-won survive the shame, the poverty, the hatred she faced for loving an American who abandoned her." Lorenzo's hands trembled. He shoved them into his pockets. Lady D turned another page. Documents yellowed with age. Letters written in careful English and Korean. A baptismal certificate from a church that probably no longer existed. And photographs, so many photographs, of his mother growing up under Lady D's watchful care. Then she turned to a photograph that shattered what remained of Lorenzo's composure. His mother, Kim Sun-hee, maybe 20 years old, beautiful despite the poverty etched in her thin frame and worn clothes. She stood outside a small church, smiling at the camera with an expression of fragile hope. And beside her, arm around her shoulders, stood Lady D. Older now, maybe in her 40s, her face radiating the same strength it held today. "Your mama and I were family," Lady D said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not by blood, but by choice. By love. I was there when she found out she was pregnant with you. There when that diplomat, your father, denied you both. There when she made the impossible decision to give you a chance at life, even if it meant dying in poverty herself." Lorenzo's carefully constructed walls began to crack. His enforcers stood frozen, witnessing something they'd never imagined, their boss on the verge of breaking. "How do you have these?" Lorenzo's voice came out raw, barely controlled. "My mother died alone. She had nothing. No one. She had me," Lady D said firmly. "Even after I returned to America in '57, we wrote letters. She sent me photographs. She told me about you, how smart you were, how determined, how you protected her even as a child. And she told me about your father, Ambassador Kong Ji-hoon, the man who threw you both away like garbage." The name hit Lorenzo like a fist. He'd spent years hunting for information about his father, years trying to prove his own existence mattered. And this woman had known all along. Kelly finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Grandma's been looking for you for years, Mr. Antonio. Ever since she saw your photo in the Chicago Tribune. Korean-American businessman opens luxury hotel on Gold Coast. She recognized your mother's eyes." Lorenzo spun toward her, fury and confusion warring on his face. "Looking for me? You've been meeting with FBI agents. I have footage of you." "Not to betray you," Kelly interrupted, her calm cutting through his rage. "To save you." "Save me?" Lorenzo laughed bitterly. "From what?" "From the people closest to you," Lady D said. She reached into a folder tucked beneath her photo album. "From the betrayal you're too blinded by power to see coming." Lorenzo didn't believe her. Couldn't believe her. Betrayal was the currency of his world. He knew its shapes, its patterns, its smell. He would have detected it. Except he hadn't detected that this elderly woman knew his deepest secrets. Lady D pulled out more documents. Lorenzo's eyes widened as he recognized official seals, government letterheads, stamps from agencies that could destroy him. His original birth certificate. Kim Lorenzo. Born in Seoul, 1992. Mother, Kim Sun-hee. Father, listed as unknown, but Lady D had attached a separate document. A DNA analysis, stamped and certified, connecting Lorenzo to Ambassador Kang Ji-hoon with 99.9% certainty. Immigration papers from 2010, showing Lorenzo's illegal entry into the United States under a falsified identity. Documents that proved Lorenzo Antonio didn't legally exist. And most dangerous of all, current photographs of Ambassador Kang, now a leading presidential candidate in South Korea, alongside news clippings about his impeccable family values and moral leadership. Lorenzo realized with sickening clarity what Lady D possessed: the power to destroy not just his criminal empire, but his very identity. The power to expose his father as a fraud, to collapse a political dynasty built on lies. The power to erase him completely. What do you want? The question came out hoarse. Money. Protection. Name your price. Every negotiation had a price. Every person had leverage they wanted to exploit. Lady D would demand something, they always did. But her answer shattered his worldview completely. I want you to change, child. Her eyes held his with an intensity that made him feel like that abandoned boy again. I want you to become the man your mama died believing you could be. Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the small apartment. Change. Lady, I'm way past redemption. I've done things that would make the devil himself flinch. There's no coming back from what I've become. Nobody's past redemption, Lady D said with absolute certainty. But it starts with the truth. She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. And the truth is, Lorenzo, you're being betrayed, just not by who you think. Tell me who's betraying me. Lorenzo's voice carried the edge of a man accustomed to answers. Now. Lady D shook her head slowly. Not until you sit down and listen to Kelly's full story. Really listen, not like a gangster deciding who lives or dies, but like a man trying to understand the truth. Lorenzo's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to grab these women, extract the information, and disappear. But those documents, his birth certificate, the DNA analysis, the immigration papers, sat in Lady D's lap like loaded guns pointed at his head. Reluctantly, he pulled out a chair at their small kitchen table. The wood creaked under his weight. His enforcers remained standing, shifting uncomfortably in the modest apartment, their expensive suits and visible weapons grotesquely out of place among the worn furniture and family photographs. Kelly took a breath, steadying herself. 3 months ago, I noticed irregularities in the Antonio Hotel's financial records. I work housekeeping, but I also help with filing in the accounting department during slow periods. Her voice grew stronger. Money was disappearing from accounts you didn't authorize. Large transfers, hundreds of thousands, moved to offshore accounts I'd never seen before. Lorenzo leaned forward. Why didn't you report this? To who? You. Kelly met his eyes. I'm a maid, Mr. Antonio. The woman who scrubs your floors. Who would believe me over your second in command? The words hit harder than she probably intended. I started watching, Kelly continued. Reviewing security footage during my breaks. That's when I saw the meetings. Vincent Russo with men in suits, always in back rooms, always off the books. One of them I recognized from the news coverage of organized crime cases. FBI, Organized Crime Division. Lorenzo's hands balled into fists on the table. You're lying. I wish I was. Kelly pulled out her phone, swiping to a folder of saved images. Agent Sarah Chen is my former roommate from Northwestern. We pledged the same sorority. When I saw Russo meeting with FBI agents, I reached out to her. Not to inform on you, but to investigate him. She turned her phone toward Lorenzo. The first photograph showed Russo sitting across from two men in a downtown cafe. Documents spread between them. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Agent Chun helped me identify the men. They're building a case, Mr. Antonio. But not against you directly. They're building it with Russo. He's been feeding them information for months. Lorenzo's world tilted. Russo wouldn't betray you. Kelly cut him off. Why not? You've built an empire on betrayal. Why would your second in command be any different? She swiped to another image. Russo shaking hands with a man Lorenzo recognized. Dmitry Volkov, head of the Russian mob's Chicago operations. His rivals. His enemies. Russo's plan is elegant, Kelly said, her voice carrying a bitter edge. Frame you for murders you didn't commit. Testify against you in exchange for full immunity. The FBI gets their case, you go to prison or end up dead, and Russo takes over the organization with federal protection. Lorenzo shook his head, but the denial felt hollow. 8 years. He and Russo had built this empire together, survived wars with rival gangs, evaded federal investigations, cemented their power over the entire South Side. But empires built on blood always drowned in it eventually. Play the audio, Lady D said quietly. Kelly's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled up a recording. She pressed play. Russo's voice filled the tiny kitchen, tinny through the phone speaker but unmistakable. The Lorenzo problem will be solved by Friday. I've got the Russians ready to move, and the feds will have their warrants. He won't see it coming. He's too busy playing Godfather to notice the knife at his back. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Lorenzo's carefully constructed worldview cracked and shattered. The maid he'd come here to kill had been protecting him. The lieutenant he'd trusted with his life had been plotting his destruction. He looked at Lady D, his voice raw. Why? Why would you help me? You don't know me. I'm everything your church probably prays against. Lady D's expression softened with something that looked almost like love. Because I made a promise to your grandmother, and to your mama. Because I see that little boy you used to be, before all this violence and pain. The boy who protected his mother even when he was starving. The boy who believed in something better. That boy died 20 years ago, Lorenzo said flatly. No, child. He's just buried under 20 years of fear and rage. Lady D glanced at Kelly. And because this young woman believes everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even you, she's been defending you at church, arguing you're not beyond saving, despite everything you represent. Lorenzo stared at Kelly, who met his gaze without flinching. Lady D leaned forward, her weathered hands folded on top of the damning documents. I'll give you all the evidence Kelly's gathered. I'll even help you take down Russo. But you have to promise me something in return. There it was. The catch. The leverage. Lorenzo's shoulders tensed. What? You use your power to rebuild this community instead of destroying it. You protect Kelly. Truly protect her, not just from Russo, but give her a real future. And you find a better way forward than the violence that's consumed you. Lorenzo stood abruptly, chair scraping against linoleum. I don't make promises to strangers. Lady D's voice stopped him at the door. I'm not a stranger, child. I'm family. And family doesn't give up on family. No matter how far they've fallen, no matter how lost they think they are. Lorenzo's hand rested on the doorknob. Behind him, his enforcers waited for orders. In front of him, freedom from this suffocating apartment, from these impossible demands, from the past trying to drag him under. But Lady D's words echoed in his skull. You're being betrayed. And the evidence didn't lie. Lorenzo returned to his penthouse as dawn bled across the Chicago skyline, his mind a war zone of conflicting intelligence. He gathered his 3 enforcers in the hallway before entering the main office. Nothing about Englewood leaves this room, he said, his voice carrying lethal finality. Not to Russo. Not to anyone. Understood. They nodded, confusion evident but loyalty intact. Inside, the office hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Lorenzo positioned himself by the windows, watching Russo coordinate operations across the room. His second-in-command moved with practiced efficiency, reviewing shipment schedules, taking calls, managing the Empire's daily machinery. Lorenzo saw him with new eyes now, watched how Russo's smile never quite reached his eyes, how his confidence bordered on arrogance, how easily he commanded loyalty from men who should have feared only Lorenzo. A serpent hiding in plain sight. Time to test the theory. Russo, Lorenzo called out. My office. Now. Russo entered, closing the door behind him. What's up, boss? Lorenzo leaned against his desk, affecting casual concern. We might have a leak. Money's moving in patterns I don't recognize. Someone's talking to people they shouldn't be. He watched Russo's micro-expressions, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted left for a fraction of a second before recovering. A leak. Russo's concerns sounded genuine. Too genuine. You have suspects? A few. Lorenzo let the silence stretch. What do you think? Russo didn't hesitate. That maid, Kelly Brown. She's been acting suspicious lately. Access to files she shouldn't have. I've seen her in areas of the hotel that aren't part of her cleaning route. There it was. How quickly Russo threw suspicion onto Kelly, trying to redirect Lorenzo's focus. Lorenzo kept his expression neutral. Interesting. I'm moving $3 million in cash Thursday night. New territory expansion into Pilsen. I need you to coordinate the transfer. Just you. Keep it tight. He provided specific details. Location, timing, contacts. Information he'd fabricated entirely. If Russo was working with the FBI, this bait would be irresistible. Consider it done, boss. Russo's eagerness flickered too bright. I'll handle everything personally. After Russo left, Lorenzo made a call to his most trusted tech specialist, a 22-year-old genius named Marcus who handled all surveillance and communications from a secure location. Monitor Russo's phone. Every call, every text, every email. I want real-time updates. 3 hours later, Marcus called back. Boss, Russo just contacted an unknown number. Burner phone, probably. The call lasted 90 seconds. Couldn't get clean audio, but I caught fragments. Thursday, 3 million, Pilsen location. Lorenzo's stomach tightened into a fist. Kelly had been telling the truth. Late that night, Lorenzo returned to Englewood alone. His Mercedes looked obscene on the rundown street. But he didn't care. He needed answers more than he needed discretion. Kelly opened the door at his knock, surprise and wariness crossing her face. Mr. Antonio. I need to see everything you have on Russo. Lady D sat in her wheelchair by the window, exactly where she'd been hours before, almost as if she'd been waiting. Come in, child. We've got work to do. Kelly brought out a cardboard box filled with months of documentation. Lorenzo spread it across their small kitchen table. Financial records showing hundreds of thousands transferred to offshore accounts. Photographs of Russo meeting with FBI agents in restaurants and parking garages. Security footage showing suspicious meetings in the Antonio Hotel's back rooms. But the most damning evidence was an audio recording Kelly played from her laptop. Russo's voice, clear and unmistakable. Lorenzo's smuggling operations run through O'Hare every Tuesday and Friday. I can give you flight numbers, cargo manifests, everything. But I need full immunity and protection when this goes down. Rage flooded Lorenzo's veins like poison. His hand instinctively moved to his weapon. I'll kill him. Tonight. I'll put a bullet in his skull and dump him in the river. If you kill him, you prove you're exactly what everyone thinks you are, Kelly said quietly. A monster who solves every problem with violence. I am exactly what everyone thinks I am, Lorenzo shot back, his voice raw. Lady D's calm voice cut through his fury. No, child. You're what your pain made you. What abandonment and poverty and rage shaped you into. But you can choose something different. There is nothing different, Lorenzo said through clenched teeth. This is my world. This is who I am. Kelly pulled up another file. There's more. Russo's also been in contact with Dmitry Volkov and the Russian syndicate. They're planning a coordinated strike, FBI raid on your operations while Russian hit squads eliminate you personally. Russo takes over what's left with federal protection and Russian partnership. She showed him intercepted messages, surveillance photos, timelines. 48 hours, Kelly said. That's all the time you have. Lorenzo felt his empire crumbling beneath his feet. A war on two fronts, federal law enforcement and Russian mob, orchestrated by the man he'd trusted most. He couldn't fight them all. Couldn't survive this kind of coordinated assault. He looked at Lady D, defeat creeping into his voice. Even if what you're saying is true, what can I do? I can't fight the FBI and the Russians alone. Lady D smiled gently, that knowing expression that seemed to see futures he couldn't imagine. You're not alone. You have me, you have Kelly, and you have something Russo doesn't. What's that? You have people in this community who remember when you were just a scared kid trying to survive, Lady D said. Some of them still believe you can be saved. Lorenzo spent the night in Lady D's modest apartment, surrounded by evidence of his own destruction. Kelly made coffee as dawn broke over Englewood. The three of them hunched over the small kitchen table like war generals planning an impossible battle. Except Lorenzo had never strategized with civilians before. Never sat in a cramped apartment drinking cheap coffee with a maid and her disabled grandmother, plotting survival. His world operated in penthouse offices and backroom deals, with enforcers and lawyers and people who understood that violence was currency. This felt insane. My church can help, Lady D said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Lorenzo looked up from the surveillance photos. Your church. My secret weapon. Lady D smiled. Grandmothers, deacons, community organizers across Englewood. We've been watching Russo's movements for weeks. We have eyes everywhere. Places your people would never think to look. Places Russo would never suspect. Kelly pulled out another folder, this one filled with handwritten notes and printed photographs. Pastor Williams has been documenting Russian vehicles in the neighborhood for the past month. Every time they scout locations, he records it. She spread the documentation across the table. Detailed logs of license plates, arrival times, patterns. Sister Martha's photographs showed Russian enforcers conducting surveillance near the Antonio Hotel. Brother Johnson, a former Chicago PD detective, had identified each man by name, linked them to known mob operations. Lorenzo stared at the intelligence, his professional assessment at war with his disbelief. You're telling me church ladies have better intelligence than my organization? We're not distracted by power, money, or ego, Lady D said simply. We just pay attention and care about our neighborhood. We notice when dangerous men start circling our streets like wolves. The documentation was thorough, damning. Better than what his own people had gathered. Kelly leaned forward. We can use Russo's strategy against him. Feed him false information about your location for Thursday night. He'll coordinate with the FBI and Russians based on bad intel. When they move, we expose his betrayal in front of your entire organization. Lorenzo's mind raced through the logistics. That requires perfect timing. One mistake and I'm dead. You're dead anyway if you do nothing, Kelly said bluntly. She was right. Russo's coordinated strike would come regardless. At least this way, Lorenzo controlled the battlefield. But it required trusting people he barely knew. Required making himself vulnerable in ways that violated every survival instinct he'd honed over 20 years. Everything in him screamed this was suicide. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Russo would strike within 24 hours. Lady D's voice cut through his internal war. I'll help you, Lorenzo. My community will help you. But you remember our agreement. I can't just walk away from my empire, Lorenzo protested. I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you to transform it. Lady D wheeled closer, her eyes holding his. Use your power differently. Build instead of destroy. Protect instead of exploit. Lorenzo opened his mouth to argue, but Lady D reached for her photo album again. She pulled out more photographs of his mother. Kim's son, he working at the Seoul church, distributing food to families even poorer than herself, her face radiant despite the poverty carved into her thin frame. Your mama had nothing, Lady D said softly. But she gave everything she had to help others. She cleaned houses to feed you, but she also shared her rice with neighbors who were starving. She died believing you'd use your strength to protect people, not exploit them. Lorenzo's hands trembled as he took the photographs. His mother's handwriting on the back of one image. Lorenzo will be better than this broken world. He will build, not destroy. The words shattered something inside him. Kelly and Lady D waited in silence, letting him process. Outside, Englewood woke to another day. Children heading to school, workers catching buses, a community surviving despite the violence and poverty Lorenzo's empire had helped perpetuate. Lorenzo made a decision that surprised even himself. All right. We do this your way. His voice came out rough. But if it goes wrong, if Kelly gets hurt. Lady D sat in her wheelchair, bathed in lamplight, Bible open on her lap. Kelly sat beside her, both women deep in prayer. They looked up as Lorenzo entered. If this goes wrong tomorrow, Lorenzo began. It won't, Lady D interrupted gently. But if it does, you'll face it with honor instead of running. You'll face it as the man you're choosing to become, not the monster you've been. She reached into a drawer beside her wheelchair and pulled out a small photograph, handing it to Lorenzo. His mother. Kim's son he. Young, smiling despite the poverty etched in her worn clothes and thin frame. The love in her eyes unmistakable. Lorenzo turned the photograph over. His mother's handwriting in Korean, faded but still legible. Do not let hatred make you small. He stared at the words, the first time he'd seen his mother's handwriting in 20 years. His hands trembled, and he didn't try to hide it. She wrote that the week before she died, Lady D said softly. Sent it to me with her last letter. She knew you'd need those words someday. Lorenzo tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket, over his heart. He returned to the hotel as Chicago's lights blazed beneath his penthouse windows. The city he'd conquered through fear and violence spread out before him like a kingdom built on sand. He thought about the abandoned child he'd been, the monster he'd become, the man he might still choose to be. Tomorrow everything changed. The door opened. Russo entered carrying coffee, his smile perfectly calibrated. Big day tomorrow, boss. You ready for the soul investors? Lorenzo looked at him, really looked at him. Saw the fake warmth, the calculated movements, the predator hiding behind loyalty's mask. Yeah, Russo. I'm ready. Lorenzo's voice carried weight Russo couldn't interpret. Are you? Russo laughed, missing the double meaning entirely. Always ready, boss. Always. After Russo left, Lorenzo pulled out his phone and texted Kelly. It's on. May God help us all. Her response came immediately. Grandma says God's been here all along. We just have to trust him. Lorenzo looked at his mother's photograph one more time, then placed it on his desk where he could see it. Trust, faith, redemption. Words that had meant nothing to him for 20 years. Tomorrow, he'd learn if they meant anything at all. 9 p.m. The Antonio Hotel penthouse conference room hummed with tension thick enough to choke on. Lorenzo sat at the head of the massive table, Chicago's skyline glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His three loyal enforcers, David, Marcus, Chen, positioned themselves strategically around the room, hands resting near concealed weapons. Russo entered with 4 of his men, all secretly loyal to him, all expecting this to be Lorenzo's last night alive. Outside, 30 floors below, FBI agents moved into tactical positions. 2 blocks away, Russian enforcers checked magazines and chambered rounds. Everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. Russo scanned the empty room, confusion flickering across his face. Where are the soul investors? Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Change of plans. Tonight's meeting is about something else. Tension spiked immediately. Russo's hand moved subtly toward the weapon beneath his jacket. Lorenzo noticed. He'd spent 20 years noticing everything, reading every micro-expression, every tell. The elevator chimed. Doors slid open, and Kelly wheeled Lady D into the conference room. The elderly woman sat calmly in her wheelchair, dressed in her Sunday best, completely unfazed by the dangerous men and loaded weapons surrounding her. Russo stared. Boss, what's the maid doing here? She's not the maid tonight, Lorenzo said quietly. Tonight she's a witness. Lady D rolled to the opposite end of the table, Kelly positioning her wheelchair with deliberate care. The old woman's eyes swept across Russo and his men with something approaching pity. Lorenzo placed his phone on the polished table. Let's talk about betrayal, Russo. He pressed play. Russo's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. The Lorenzo problem will be solved by Friday. I'll testify to everything. Lorenzo's smuggling operations, the murders, the money laundering. I'll give the FBI everything they need. Color drained from Russo's face. His jaw clenched. Then his expression hardened into something predatory and desperate. His 4 men reached for their weapons, but Lorenzo's enforcers were faster, guns appearing like magic, trained on Russo's crew. "Don't," David said simply. Russo's men froze. "Boss, I can explain," Russo started. "Explain how you've been planning to kill me?" Lorenzo cut him off. "Explain the Russians downstairs waiting to put bullets in my skull? Explain this." He spread photographs across the table. Russo meeting with FBI agents in cafes and parking garages, shaking hands with Dmitry Volkov, bank statements showing hundreds of thousands transferred to offshore accounts in Russo's name. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Russo's desperation exploded into violence. He drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Lorenzo's head. "You think you're untouchable? You're a dinosaur, Lorenzo. This empire needs new leadership, and I'm going to give it exactly that." Lorenzo remained perfectly calm, which seemed to unnerve Russo more than fear would have. "You're right. It does need new leadership. But not yours. I've got the FBI downstairs and the Russians in the lobby," Russo snarled. "You're done. You're dead. This is over." In the tense silence, Lady D's voice cut through like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Vincent Russo, you poor, foolish man." Russo spun toward her, gun still raised. "Shut up, old woman." Lady D didn't even blink. "You thought you were so clever. Thought you'd outplayed everyone. But you forgot one thing." "What's that?" Russo's voice cracked slightly. Lady D smiled. "You forgot that people like you always underestimate people like me." Kelly pressed a button on her phone. Screens around the conference room blazed to life. Live surveillance feeds lit up the walls, FBI vans pulling away from the hotel, agents standing down. Building security footage showing Russian enforcers being handcuffed by a different FBI unit, thrown against police vehicles. Agent Sarah Chen's face appeared on the main screen via video call. "Mr. Vincent Russo," she said with professional precision, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and about 15 other federal charges. The evidence provided by Miss Brown was more than sufficient." Russo's world collapsed in real time. His face went from rage to confusion to dawning horror as he realized he'd been completely outmaneuvered. The FBI he thought was coming for Lorenzo had actually been coming for him all along. His men dropped their weapons, hands rising in surrender. They'd signed up for criminal enterprise, not federal conspiracy charges. But Russo, cornered and desperate, did what cornered animals do. He lashed out at the weakest target. He spun, redirecting his weapon toward Lady D. "If I'm going down." Lorenzo moved faster than anyone thought possible. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hand catching Russo's wrist and twisting with brutal efficiency. The gun clattered to the floor. Lorenzo slammed Russo against the floor-to-ceiling window, the glass rattling from the impact. Lorenzo's own weapon appeared, pressed against Russo's temple. His finger rested on the trigger. 20 years of violence and survival screamed at him to pull it. To end the threat. To send the message he'd always sent. Betray Lorenzo Antonio, and you die. Russo whimpered. "Please, boss, please." Lorenzo's hand trembled with rage. One squeeze. That's all it would take. Lady D's voice reached him through the fury. Lorenzo, this is the moment. Choose who you're going to be. Lorenzo held Russo against the window, gun pressed to his temple, finger resting on the trigger. Every instinct honed over 20 years of survival screamed at him to pull it. End the betrayal. Eliminate the threat. Send the message he'd always sent. Cross Lorenzo Antonio, and you die. Russo's whimpering filled the silence. Please, boss, please. But Lady D's words echoed through Lorenzo's mind, louder than the rage. Choose who you're going to be. Lorenzo's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the war between violence and restraint. He closed his eyes and saw his mother's photograph, her handwriting in faded Korean ink. Do not let hatred make you small. His finger eased off the trigger. He lowered the gun. FBI agent Sarah Chen entered with her tactical team, badges gleaming under the conference room lights. Russo was spun around, hands wrenched behind his back, metal handcuffs biting into his wrists. Vincent Russo, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. His rights were read in clipped, professional tones. His men were processed one by one, led away in handcuffs. The evidence Kelly had gathered, months of documentation, recordings, financial records, would bury him for decades. As agents dragged him toward the elevator, Russo twisted back, screaming at Lorenzo with the fury of the defeated. You're finished. You think changing sides makes you good. You're still a monster, Lorenzo. You're still. The elevator doors closed, cutting off his voice. The conference room emptied until only Lorenzo, Lady D, Kelly, and his 3 loyal enforcers remained. They stood in shocked silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like ash. David, a man who'd beaten rivals to death with his bare hands, spoke first. Boss, what just happened? Lorenzo stared at his hands. Hands that had pulled triggers, broken bones, built an empire on blood. I don't know. Something different. Lorenzo Antonio. Lady D's voice commanded the room. Come here. He approached her wheelchair slowly, like a child called before a principal. She looked up at him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see through every wall he'd ever built. You kept your word, she said softly. You chose justice over vengeance. Your mama would be proud. Emotions Lorenzo had suppressed for 20 years rose in his chest like a flood threatening to drown him. But we're not finished, Lady D continued. You made me a promise. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. I helped you take down Russo. I didn't kill him. What more do you want? Lady D's expression remained gentle but unyielding. I want you to show your people what real power looks like. She gestured to his 3 enforcers, to Kelly, to the city sprawling beyond the windows. I want you to bow. I don't bow to anyone. Lorenzo's voice hardened. That's not who I am. That's exactly who you've been, Lady D countered. A man so afraid of being vulnerable that you became hard as stone. So afraid of being abandoned that you abandoned your own humanity. You don't understand what I've had to do to survive. I understand perfectly. Lady D's voice carried the weight of her own battles. I survived poverty that would break you, racism that tried to erase me, war that took everyone I loved. But I never let it make me cruel. And neither did your mother. She opened her photo album one more time, turning to a photograph that made Lorenzo's breath catch. His mother holding baby Lorenzo, her face radiating pure love despite the poverty carved into her thin frame. The way she looked at her child, like he was the entire world, like he was worth every sacrifice. She loved you more than life itself, Lady D said, her voice thick with emotion. She died hoping you'd be brave enough to be gentle, strong enough to be kind. Tears streamed down Lorenzo's face, the first time he'd cried in 20 years. He tried to hide them, to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Kelly stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Antonio, you don't owe me anything. But you owe yourself this. For 20 years you've been running from the child whose father abandoned him. But you can't outrun pain. You have to face it. And sometimes, facing it means admitting you can't do it alone. Lorenzo looked at his enforcers. David, Marcus, Chen. Hardened criminals who'd killed for him, who'd never seen their boss vulnerable, who watched him now with uncertainty and something approaching awe. He made his decision. Lorenzo dropped to both knees before Lady D's wheelchair. Complete silence crashed over the room. His enforcers froze, hands instinctively moving toward weapons before stopping, confused about what threat they were supposed to neutralize. Lorenzo lowered his head completely, forehead touching the floor in the traditional Korean gesture of ultimate respect. The gesture his mother had taught him as a child, before violence had made him forget everything gentle. His voice broke as he spoke. I bow to you, Lady D. I bow to my mother's memory. I bow to the child I was before I became this thing. Forgive me. Lady D placed her weathered hand on his head like a benediction, like a grandmother blessing a prodigal grandson. I forgive you, child. And more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. Now rise. Not as the monster you became, but as the man you're choosing to be. Lorenzo lifted his head, tears streaming freely now, and he didn't try to hide them. His enforcers stared in shock. They'd seen their boss kill without hesitation, had watched him destroy lives with cold calculation, but they'd never seen him like this. Human. David's voice came out rough with emotion. Boss, what do we do now? Lorenzo stood, wiping his eyes, looking at each of his men with new clarity. We rebuild. Not just the organization, everything. We rebuild our lives, our community, our souls if we still have them. Kelly smiled through her own tears. Lady D nodded approvingly, her eyes shining. Now you're ready for the real work. 6 months later. The Donna Brown Community Center rose from Englewood streets like a promise kept. Gleaming glass and steel where abandoned buildings had once stood, state-of-the-art facilities designed for disabled elders and their families. Hundreds gathered for the grand opening. Korean American and Black community members side by side, former rivals shaking hands, ministers and activists and people who'd watched their neighborhood bleed for decades finally seeing something built instead of destroyed. News cameras documented everything. This was the story Chicago couldn't believe. The notorious mafia boss turned community builder. Lorenzo had dismantled his criminal empire piece by piece. The illegal operations, smuggling, loan sharking, protection rackets, shut down or turned over to authorities. He'd kept the legitimate businesses. Hotels, restaurants, real estate holdings. Used that wealth to fund community programs across the South Side. Job training centers, after-school programs, elder care facilities. Not all his former associates had followed this new path. Some left. Some challenged him, seeing change as weakness. But Lorenzo navigated these threats with a different kind of strength now. Purpose instead of fear, conviction instead of rage. At the podium, Lorenzo stood uncomfortable and stiff, a man more accustomed to boardrooms than public speaking. Lady D sat prominently in the front row, her wheelchair decorated with flowers. Kelly sat beside her, now director of the community center, her face radiant with pride. Lorenzo's speech was brief, honest, raw. For 20 years, I took from this community. I profited from people's pain. I thought power meant making people fear me. He paused, his voice catching. I was wrong. He gestured toward Lady D. This woman taught me that real power is making people believe in themselves. That real strength is lifting others up, not tearing them down. When he finished, Lorenzo walked to Lady D's wheelchair and bowed before her again. Not from obligation this time, but from genuine love and respect. The entire room rose in applause. Cameras flashed. Former enemies witnessed the impossible transformation. Pastor Williams stood, raising his hands. Miracles do happen, church. We're seeing one today. After the ceremony, Lorenzo and Kelly stood together watching the celebration unfold. Children playing in spaces designed for their joy, elders laughing in wheelchairs, communities that had been divided finding common ground. Kelly was his business partner now, managing the legitimate empire with skill that humbled him. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected, a deep bond of trust and respect. You know people are still skeptical, right? Kelly said. They're waiting to see if this is real or just good PR. Lorenzo nodded. I know. I'm skeptical too. But every day I choose this path instead of the old one, it gets a little easier. Kelly smiled. Grandma knew you had it in you all along. Lady D held court from her wheelchair like the queen she was, surrounded by young and old seeking her wisdom. She caught Lorenzo's eye and waved him over. Come here, child. There's someone I want you to meet. A young Korean-American man stood beside her, maybe 19, wearing the defensive posture Lorenzo recognized intimately. Lady D made the introduction. This is Michael. He needs a mentor. Someone who understands where he's been and where he could go. Lorenzo looked at this kid and saw himself 20 years ago. Angry, scared, searching for belonging in all the wrong places. They talked. Lorenzo shared his real story. The abandonment, the rage, the violence, and the redemption that came through an elderly woman who refused to give up on him. Michael's skepticism was palpable. Why should I listen to you? You're just another rich guy now. You're right to be skeptical, Lorenzo said quietly. But I'm also the only person in this room who knows exactly what you're feeling. And I'm here to tell you there's another way. 2 years later, Lady D's 90th birthday filled the community center with music, laughter, and love. The facility had served hundreds of families, changed countless lives, rebuilt futures that violence and poverty had nearly destroyed. Lorenzo arrived carrying a gift that had taken months to arrange. He'd located Lady D's family in Korea, distant relatives she'd lost contact with decades ago, and arranged for them to visit Chicago. When he showed her the photographs, tears streamed down her weathered face. Lorenzo knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hand. "You gave me back my past, Lady D. Showed me who my mother was, who I was supposed to be. Now I'm giving you back yours." She touched his face with trembling fingers. "You were so lost, Lorenzo. So angry. Look at you now." "I'm still finding my way," he admitted. "But for the first time in my life, I'm not running from where I came from. I'm building towards something better." She smiled through her tears. "Your mama would be so proud." "I'm proud." As the party continued, Lorenzo and Kelly stepped outside. Evening settled over Englewood, streetlights flickering on like promises. "You good?" Kelly asked. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. "I spent my whole life building an empire so I'd never feel powerless again. So I'd never be that kid whose father threw him away like garbage. But all that power just made me empty." He looked at her. "Your grandmother, she's in a wheelchair, she's 90. She's got nothing but old photographs and a lifetime of faith. And she brought me to my knees. She changed everything." "That's Lady D," Kelly said softly. "She's got a way of seeing what people really need, even when they don't see it themselves." What did she see in me? A boy who never got to be loved. A man who forgot he was human. Someone worth saving. Lorenzo was silent then. "Thank you, Kelly. For risking everything to protect me. For believing I could be more than what I was. Don't thank me yet. You've still got a long way to go. Rebuilding trust, making real amends, staying clean of your old life, that's the hard part. The bow was just the beginning." "I know. But for the first time, I actually want to do the hard part. I want to earn the respect I used to just take." Through the windows, Lady D sat surrounded by children and grandchildren. She caught Lorenzo's eye and waved, gesturing for him to come inside. "She's calling you," Kelly said. Lorenzo smiled. "She's always calling me. Back to who I should have been all along." They walked back inside together. Lorenzo realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not power, not revenge, not validation from the father who abandoned him. Family, purpose, redemption. And it all started with a bow. Lorenzo knelt beside Lady D's wheelchair, holding her hand, surrounded by community, family, and hope. For a man who'd spent 2 decades believing vulnerability was fatal, this moment of connection was revolutionary. The Mafia Boss had become a community builder. The monster had remembered how to be human. And it all began when he was brave enough to bow. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, Hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.